Hey there, my name's Paul, and this episode is part of a series called Glimpses of Jesus. We're going on a journey through the Old Testament in the Bible. The aim is to look at the main events, to examine them, and think about how they point us to Jesus and salvation in Him. The passage we're looking at here is Genesis chapter 21 and verses 1 to 7. It's a huge event in God's unfolding plan of redemption. That's His plan to save people from sin through Jesus. Here, Abraham and Sarah have a son called Isaac. Whenever I visit new parents, I often see a particular look in their eyes. It's a mixture of tiredness and pride, of exhaustion and joy. Holding the baby, the parents beam from ear to ear. I wonder how Abraham and Sarah would have looked as they held baby Isaac. His birth is massive. They've been waiting for this day for years. It's been 25 years since God made His promise to them. Abraham at 100 years old and Sarah at 90 years old finally have a child of their own. Yet the significance of this day is bigger than this. Here's another step in God's unfolding plan of redemption. Another step towards Jesus. So what are we told here about baby Isaac? Well, first, he's a promised child. We see that in verse 1. The Lord came to Sarah as He had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what He had promised. Isaac wasn't born into a vacuum. He was born into the context of God's promises. Promises that God had made a long time ago. Right back in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 2 we read, I will make you into a great nation. That was 25 years before Isaac was born. Now I don't know about you, but I find waiting hard. Have you ever ordered something from eBay? Not every seller posts immediately. I find it frustrating as I check the tracking link and they still haven't dropped it off at the parcel shop. And that's just on day one. Imagine waiting 25 years for this great promise of God to even look like it might come true. Yet here's the answer. Isaac, the child of promise. But God didn't merely promise that Isaac would be born. He'd promised that Isaac would be an immensely significant child. In Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3 we read, I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Through Abraham, the world will be blessed. Yet how? Not just through his existence. As we read the Bible, we see that his descendants, and ultimately one descendant, Jesus, play an important role. Isaac is a substantial step in bringing this about. He's a boy whose life and actions will make a difference on a global scale. So Isaac is a promised child. And in this way, and we're going to point this out all the way through this passage, in this way he's similar to Jesus. Right back in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, God makes a promise regarding the spiritual battle between the devil and God's people. I will put hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. Ultimately, who's he speaking about? Jesus, the one who came and defeated the devil at the cross. Jesus, the one who paid for sin. Jesus, the one who brings forgiveness for everyone who trusts in him. Here's a promise of Jesus. And then, at least 4,000 years later, Jesus is born. Just like Isaac, the child of promise. So Isaac was a promised child, but he's also a miraculous child. Here's Genesis chapter 21 and verse 2. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. At the appointed time, God had told him. Consider the facts here. Abraham and Sarah were getting on in age and had missed the window for having children. That's not just me saying that. Genesis chapter 18 and verse 11 tells us, Abraham and Sarah were old and getting on in years. Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. What does that mean? For Sarah to get pregnant, for Abraham and Sarah to have a baby, God would need to step in and do something miraculous. Sarah knows that too. When God said she would have a baby, this is how she responded. In Genesis chapter 18 and verse 12, she laughed to herself. After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I have delight? Imagine having a baby in your 90s. I'd be thinking about energy levels and how to cope with parenting a young child. I'm sure this crossed Sarah's mind, but she's also facing up to the realities of her body, a body past the age of childbearing. How can she have a baby? Only through a miracle. And yet Isaac is born. What's the conclusion? God did a miracle. Here's a miraculous child. Again, there's similarity between Isaac and Jesus. Jesus is a miraculous baby too. Although with Jesus, the miracle of his conception is on a different stratosphere. Here's Luke chapter 1 and verses 34 and 35. Mary, that's Mary, the mother of Jesus. Mary asked the angel, "How can this be, since I have not had sexual relations with a man?" Basically, how can I have a child? The angel replied to her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God." With Isaac, God just fixed what was broken in Sarah's body. The baby was conceived normally. For Jesus, God did something unheard of, a completely miraculous conception. Jesus is the ultimate miraculous child. Next, in Genesis chapter 21 and verse 4 we read, "When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God had commanded him." What's the significance of circumcision here? Well, it's an act of obedience by Abraham. Notice, Abraham did this as God had commanded him. This stems from Genesis 17. In verse 12, God tells Abraham, "Throughout your generations, every male among you is to be circumcised at 8 days old. Every male born in your household, or purchased from any foreigner, and not your offspring." Obedience is important in following God. It's not always easy. We all struggle with being told what to do, even if it's God who's doing the telling, especially if we don't understand what God commands, or it's not in line with what we want. But God is God and we are not. He's the King, and it's our job to obey. It doesn't matter what area of life we're thinking about, whether issues of identity, how we treat others, how we become a Christian, what it means to belong to a church, the call to witness for Jesus. We don't get to set this for ourselves. It's God's place to speak and ours to listen and obey. Abraham circumcised Isaac. Why? Because it was God's command. Yet there's more here. Circumcision is connected to the covenant relationship that Abraham had with God. In Genesis chapter 17 and verse 7 we read, "I will confirm my covenant that is between me and you and your future offspring throughout their generations." It is a permanent covenant to be your God and the God of your offspring after you. How did God confirm the covenant? What sign did he give that demonstrated his commitment to Abraham and his descendants, and their commitment to God? Circumcision. Covenant relationship is a relationship soaked and bound with promises. Isaac was the child of promise, the one who would take the covenant into the next generation. And here, he's receiving the sign and the seal of those promises. He's the child of the covenant. Again, let's see the similarity to Jesus. In Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16 we read, "Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed." He does not say, "and to seeds," as though referring to many, but referring to one, "and to your seed," who is Christ. When God made his promises to Abraham, when he made a covenant with Abraham and his descendants, he had one descendant particularly in mind, Jesus. Jesus who would live as the perfect follower of God. Jesus who would die as the sacrifice to pay for the sins of God's people. Jesus who would rise and be the first of a new, restored, redeemed humanity. In Galatians 3, we're being told that Jesus is the covenant child who inherits every promise of God. And he doesn't do that just for himself. He does that for us too. In Galatians chapter 3 and verse 29 we read, "If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise." What's that saying? If we believe in Jesus, we become part of the covenant. We become one of Abraham's descendants. We become part of the nation of God, his kingdom, his people. That's pretty incredible. So we've seen that Abraham obeyed God and circumcised Isaac. But what about Sarah? In Genesis chapter 21 and verse 6 we read, Sarah said, "God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears will laugh with me." A couple of pages earlier in Genesis, Sarah laughs, but her laugh there is very different. There, it's the laugh of unbelief. It's cynical and full of doubt. It's wondering if God has lost his marbles. But in chapter 21, the laughter is different. Here, Sarah's over the moon. She's filled with a deep joy. Here's the child she's longed for. Here's the child that will pass on their legacy. Here's the child who will take God's plan of salvation forward to the next generation. Here's a child of joy. Again, isn't there similarity here between Isaac and Jesus? When Jesus was born, the dark sky over the hills around Bethlehem was lit up as an angel delivered a message to a few shepherds. The angel said to them, "Don't be afraid, for look, I proclaim to you good news of great joy that will be for all the people." The message of Jesus is a message of joy. A short while later, Jesus' parents brought him to the temple in Jerusalem. There, an old man called Simeon approached, guided by the Holy Spirit and full of joy. In Luke chapter 2 and verses 28 to 32 we read, Simeon took him up in his arms, praised God, and said, "Now, Master, you can dismiss your servant in peace, as you promised. For my eyes have seen your salvation. You have prepared it in the presence of all peoples, a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and glory to your people Israel." Jesus is the child of joy. He came to bring joy. He died and rose so that we could know joy. Look, facing up to our sin is hard. The rebuke of God for the lives we've lived is difficult. The continuous struggle with our sinful hearts and the brokenness surrounding us is wearying. Yet knowing Jesus, knowing forgiveness, knowing hope for the future, this is joy. The birth of Isaac was a significant day, not just because here is a family with a child, but here's the next step in God's plan of redemption. That makes this our story, not just Abraham's story. It means it's relevant today, not just then. It matters here, not just there. It's God's plan and God's purpose for a broken world, for you and for me. Isaac was a special child, but later, Jesus would come and eclipse him.